My father left my brothers $3.6 million in Medicare fraud proceeds, luxury cars, investment properties, and business partnerships. To me, he left nothing but a conservatorship petition. At his 75th birthday gala, he stood before 300 guests and declared, "Grace has always been too confused to handle real responsibility." The family applauded. Board members laughed. Investors nodded approvingly. As I walked out in tears, my face burning with shame, an old family lawyer stopped me in the hallway. She pressed a sealed envelope into my hands left by my mother, who died knowing this day would come. The first line read, "If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from?" Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The desert morning slipped through Grace Adler's kitchen blinds in thin golden strips. She sat at her small oak table, 65 years of careful living visible in how she arranged her daily medications beside a steaming cup of coffee. The pill organizer sat open like a rainbow of modern aging. White tablets for blood pressure. Yellow ones for cholesterol. The tiny blue pill that kept her heart beating steadily while her mind wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. Grace had learned patience through 4 decades of nursing. Emergency rooms taught you that rushing led to mistakes, that careful observation revealed more than quick assumptions. This morning, those instincts whispered warnings she was not ready to hear. The Social Security letter lay beside her coffee cup. She had read it 3 times already, each reading bringing confusion instead of clarity. The government paper felt substantial between her fingers, official enough to demand attention, strange enough to resist understanding. Overpayment recovery, $180 month deduction beginning next month. Reason: long-term care services, January through June 2023. Grace set down her coffee with steady hands. The problem was simple and terrifying. She had never been in long-term care. Never toured nursing facilities. Never filled out admission paperwork. Never surrendered her independence to institutional schedules where strangers decided when you ate, slept, and saw sunlight. Yet here was her name, printed with bureaucratic authority, connected to services she had never received, bills she had never seen, care that existed only on paper. But was substantial enough to reduce her monthly income by nearly $200. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint desert dust that crept through window seals despite her careful housekeeping. Outside, heat waves shimmered above the asphalt where her Honda Civic sat in the driveway like proof that she remained capable of independent transportation, decision-making. And the 1,000 small competencies that defined adult life in America. Grace pressed the letter flat against the table surface and studied each line again. The reference numbers looked authentic. The letterhead carried official seals. The language used phrases she recognized from her nursing years when Medicare billing had been someone else's responsibility. Handled by office staff who understood insurance codes she never needed to learn. Now those same codes were being used to describe a version of her life that did not match her memory or experience. According to this document, she had spent months receiving institutional care while she remembered watering her desert garden, volunteering at the free clinic, and driving herself to grocery stores where she selected her own food according to her own preferences. She reached for her cordless phone and dialed Mark's number with fingers that moved deliberately across familiar buttons. Her brother answered on the second ring, voice carrying the efficient energy of someone managing important business matters from an office that probably overlooked the Phoenix skyline. She could no longer afford to see from her own windows. "Grace? Is everything okay?" The question carried undertones of assumption, as if her calls had become synonymous with problems that needed quick solutions, rather than connections that deserved patient attention. Grace heard the subtle shift in his tone when family became administrative tasks rather than relationships requiring emotional investment. "I'm looking at a letter from Social Security," she said, working to keep her voice level and factual. "It says I owe money for long-term care services, but Mark, I've never been in any facility like that." The pause stretched long enough for Grace to wonder if the connection had failed. Then Mark's voice returned, shifted into the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to resolving confusion through proper channels and professional expertise. "Oh, that." His dismissal carried the confidence of experience. "Dad's billing team coordinates all the medical insurance for family members. You're probably misreading the codes." Just take a photo with your phone and text it to me. Through the phone connection, Grace heard ambient sounds of corporate efficiency. Papers rustling with purpose. The distant murmur of voices discussing matters that required urgent attention. A chair scraping across what sounded like polished marble floors where serious people made serious decisions about other people's financial futures. Then a voice in the background, urgent and partially muffled, "Sir? The state auditors are here early." The line went quiet except for Mark's hand covering the receiver. Grace held her breath, listening to silence that felt weighted with implications she could not yet name. When his voice returned, it carried slightly breathless quality of someone managing multiple crises while trying to maintain appearances of control. "Look, Grace, don't worry about this letter. Dad's legal people handle Medicare mix-ups for family members all the time. These government systems make mistakes constantly. It's probably just a computer error somewhere that will get sorted out automatically." After Mark hung up, Grace sat with the phone in her hand, listening to the empty dial tone. The reassurance felt too smooth, too ready, as if he had given similar explanations to other people facing similar inexplicable bills. She found herself nodding despite his inability to see her, the automatic deference of someone trained to respect expertise. Even when personal experience suggested the experts might be wrong. The morning routine continued with mechanical precision. Dishes washed and dried. Bed made with hospital corners that remained sharp after 40 years away from institutional training. Pills counted and consumed according to carefully maintained schedules that kept her body functioning despite the slow rebellion of aging. But the letter remained on her kitchen table like evidence of a crime she could not yet name. That afternoon brought the familiar rhythm of local television news. Grace folded laundry while half listening to traffic reports, weather updates, and human interest stories designed to fill spaces between pharmaceutical advertisements promising relief from conditions she hoped never to develop. The news anchor's voice filled her living room with professional concern as the screen displayed faces she recognized despite never meeting them. Elderly people with confused eyes and trembling hands, describing hospital bills for procedures they had never received, nursing home charges for care they had never needed, medical histories that seemed to belong to strangers who happened to share their names and social security numbers. Grace stopped folding. The pillowcase in her hands grew wrinkled as her grip tightened. These were people like her. Careful with money because they had so little. Trusting of official documents because they had been raised to respect authority. Confused by systems too complex for anyone to navigate without professional help that might not be available when needed most. The fraud hotline number appeared briefly on screen. Grace lunged for a pen, scribbling digits on a yellow sticky note with handwriting that looked shakier than usual. The numbers seemed to glow against bright paper as she pressed the note to her television frame, the adhesive feeling permanent despite her trembling fingers. She deliberately looked away, allowing the warning sign to exist in peripheral vision like an option she was not ready to exercise, but could not bring herself to discard. The bright yellow square pulsed with possibility and danger in equal measure. Evening settled over Mesa in familiar layers of purple and orange that reminded Grace why she had chosen this place for retirement. The colors were honest here, straightforward desert beauty without pretense or hidden meanings. Just the daily performance of sun and sky above mountains that had witnessed human drama without judgment or interference. Grace returned to her kitchen table and gathered the SSA notice, Medicare card, and pill organizer into neat arrangement that had become evening ritual. The familiar task of organizing medical information provided comfort her racing thoughts could not, each item positioned with precision. She had once applied to preparing medication trays for patients who trusted her competence when their own bodies failed in ways they could not understand. Outside her kitchen window, desert heat pressed against glass with persistence of weather that refused to acknowledge human preferences for comfort. Despite air conditioning's mechanical efforts, perspiration gathered along her hairline. Her body's honest response to stress that no amount of mental discipline could completely suppress. She opened the letter one more time, studying each word, as if repetition might reveal hidden meanings or expose obvious mistakes she had somehow overlooked during earlier readings. The language remained stubbornly opaque, designed for people who understood insurance systems and billing procedures that had always been someone else's responsibility. "Who's using my name?" she whispered to the empty room. The words hung in cooling air like smoke from a fire she had not meant to start. Speaking the suspicion aloud made it feel more real, more threatening than when confined to private thoughts. Where she could pretend it was just paranoid imagination rather than rational response to genuinely suspicious circumstances. Grace slid the papers into an old manila folder that had once held nursing schedules from her final years at the hospital. The irony was not lost on her. Files that had once organized her professional life now contained evidence that someone might be organizing her medical history without consultation or consent. She carried the folder to her bedroom along with the Medicare card and the yellow sticky note bearing the fraud hotline number. On her nightstand, these documents looked different under soft lamplight. Less official, more personal. The shadows they cast stretched across her reading glasses. And the small framed photograph of her parents, connecting everything in ways she was only beginning to understand. Grace rubbed her left wrist with slow, circular motions, following the pattern of an old habit from ICU days when stress made joints sing with arthritic pain that seemed to echo distress signals. Her mind sent when patterns emerged from chaos in ways that suggested dangers she had not been trained to recognize. Her parents gazed out from their silver frame with expressions of trust and optimism that belonged to people who believed institutions existed to serve. Rather than exploit, that families protected rather than preyed upon their vulnerable members, that growing old in America meant dignity. Rather than becoming targets for schemes too complex to understand and too profitable to abandon. Tomorrow, she would call the number on the yellow sticky note. Tonight, she would allow herself to feel the full weight of not knowing who had decided her life story included chapters she had never written, medical care she had never received, bills for someone else's version of her existence that nonetheless carried her name and demanded her money. The desert wind rattled her bedroom window with gentle persistence, like fingers tapping against glass to remind her that some truths could only be discovered by people brave enough to ask questions. That might not have comfortable answers, that might lead to places where family loyalty and personal safety became luxuries she could no longer afford. Grace turned off the bedside lamp and lay in darkness, listening to her house settle around her with familiar creaks and sighs of a structure that had weathered many storms, but might not be prepared for whatever was approaching with the stealth of something that preferred to remain hidden until resistance became impossible. The letter's implications expanded in the quiet like ink in water, staining everything with possibility of betrayal she was not ready to name. But somewhere between sleep and waking, her nurse's training whispered truths. She could not ignore symptoms that didn't match diagnoses usually meant someone was lying about the disease. Grace sat at her kitchen table the next morning, staring at the yellow sticky note with the fraud hotline number. The coffee in her cup had grown cold while she gathered courage to make a phone call that might change everything. Sunlight streamed through her blinds, casting familiar patterns across the Social Security letter that had started all of this uncertainty. She dialed the number with deliberate precision. Each digit felt significant, like she was unlocking a door she might not be able to close again. The phone rang 3 times before a recorded voice greeted her with professional efficiency. "Thank you for calling the Medicare fraud hotline. Your call is important to us. Please hold while we connect you to the next available representative." Grace waited through 15 minutes of hold music that cycled between cheerful jazz and announcements about reporting healthcare fraud. The repetition felt hypnotic, almost designed to make callers give up before speaking to an actual person. She pressed the phone against her ear and watched dust motes dance in the morning light, wondering if persistence would be rewarded or punished. "This is Jennifer with Medicare Fraud Prevention. How can I help you today?" The voice sounded young and tired, like someone who had already fielded dozens of similar calls before noon. Grace cleared her throat and launched into her carefully rehearsed explanation about the Social Security letter, the long-term care charges, and her certainty that she had never received such services. "I understand your concern, ma'am. Let me pull up your file." The keyboard clicking sounded tinny through the phone connection. "Can you verify your Medicare ID number for me?" Grace read the numbers from her Medicare card, pronouncing each digit clearly. More typing. A long pause that stretched until she wondered if the connection had failed. "Okay, I see the charges you're referring to." But ma'am, I need to transfer you to the Medicare Benefits Administration. We handle fraud reports, but billing questions go through a different department. Before Grace could object, hold music resumed. The transfer felt like being passed between strangers who each claimed someone else could solve her problems. She glanced at her kitchen clock and realized she had already spent 45 minutes navigating phone systems designed to discourage rather than assist. The next voice belonged to someone who sounded even more harried than the first representative. Medicare benefits, this is David. I understand you have questions about recent charges? Grace repeated her story, working to keep frustration out of her voice. She explained about never being in long-term care, about the mysterious charges that were reducing her monthly income, about needing someone to investigate what seemed like obvious billing errors. Ma'am, I see your account here, and these charges were submitted by authorized healthcare providers with proper documentation. If you believe there's an error, you'll need to contact the facilities directly to dispute their claims. What facilities? Grace asked. I don't know what facilities you're talking about. I've never been to any long-term care facility. The charges were submitted by Sunset Manor Care Center and Desert Springs Rehabilitation Services. Both are legitimate healthcare providers in your area. They would have records of your admission and treatment. Grace wrote down the names with shaking hands. The facilities sounded official, professional, exactly the kind of places that would have proper paperwork and trained staff. But she had never heard of either one, never visited their locations, never signed admission forms or consent documents. Can you give me their contact information? I can't provide that information over the phone for privacy reasons. You'll need to contact them through directory assistants or your primary care physician's office. They would have referral records if you were a patient. After David hung up, Grace sat with the phone in her lap, staring at the facility names she had written on a piece of paper. Sunset Manor Care Center. Desert Springs Rehabilitation Services. The words looked official typed in her careful handwriting, but they felt like foreign language when connected to her own medical history. She called directory assistants and obtained phone numbers for both facilities. The first call went to Sunset Manor, where a receptionist answered with practiced cheerfulness that sounded designed to calm worried family members. Sunset Manor Care Center, this is Amanda. How may I help you? I received a Medicare statement showing charges for long-term care at your facility, but I've never been a patient there. I'd like to verify whether you have records under my name. I'd be happy to check that for you. Can you provide your full name and date of birth? Grace provided the information and waited while Amanda searched their system. The hold music was different here, softer and more suitable for people dealing with end-of-life care decisions. It made her stomach tighten with anxiety about places she hoped never to need. Ms. Adler, I do show records indicating you were a resident here from January through March of this year. You were admitted for post-surgical rehabilitation following a cardiac procedure. Grace felt the kitchen floor shift beneath her feet. The room tilted slightly, as if gravity had been adjusted without warning. That's impossible. I never had cardiac surgery. I've never been a patient at your facility. Someone has made a serious mistake. I understand your confusion, ma'am, but our records are quite detailed. You were admitted on January 15 following a cardiac catheterization procedure. Your son Mark Adler was listed as your emergency contact and financial guarantor. The name hit like cold water. Mark had signed paperwork at this facility she had never visited, authorizing care she had never received, using her identity for purposes she could not understand. Grace gripped the phone with both hands to stop them from shaking. I need copies of those records immediately. I'm sorry, but we can only release medical records to patients or their authorized representatives. If you'd like to dispute these charges, you'll need to come in person with proper identification and speak with our billing department. Grace called Desert Springs Rehabilitation next, her movements mechanical now, driven by momentum rather than hope. The conversation followed a similar pattern. Official-sounding records, detailed documentation of care she had never received, Mark's name as emergency contact and financial guarantor. According to their files, she had been a patient there from April through June, receiving physical therapy and occupational therapy following complications from her cardiac procedure. The therapist notes described a confused elderly woman who required assistance with basic daily activities due to cognitive decline following her surgery. Grace had never been more cognitively clear in her life than during those months when she was supposedly confused and dependent. She had been volunteering at the free clinic, helping elderly patients navigate exactly the kind of billing problems she was now experiencing herself. After hanging up, she sat in her kitchen surrounded by the evidence of someone else's version of her life. According to official records maintained by professional healthcare facilities, she had spent the first 6 months of this year as an incapacitated elderly woman requiring institutional care. According to her memory and personal calendar, she had spent those same months living independently, driving her own car, making her own decisions, and helping other people solve problems exactly like this one. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile through simple mistake or clerical error. This required deliberate deception, systematic fraud, and her own brother's signature on documents that transformed her from person to patient without her knowledge or consent. Grace walked to her bathroom mirror and studied her reflection with new scrutiny. Same face, same silver hair, same blue eyes that had seen 40 years of medical emergencies and human crises. But according to multiple healthcare facilities, this woman had been cognitively impaired and physically dependent for half a year, while continuing to live what she experienced as a normal, independent life. She returned to the kitchen and spread out all the papers she had collected. The Social Security letter, the facility names and phone numbers, the Medicare card that had apparently been used to authorize care she had never received. Together, they told a story that made no sense unless someone was systematically stealing her identity for financial purposes. But not just anyone. Someone who had access to her Medicare information, knowledge of her medical history, and authority to sign documents on her behalf. Someone who could coordinate billing between multiple facilities and government agencies. Someone with the legal standing to make medical decisions for family members. Grace picked up her phone and called Mark's office number, the same one she had dialed yesterday, when this had still seemed like a simple billing mistake that could be resolved through proper channels and family cooperation. Mark Adler's office, this is Susan. This is Grace Adler, Mark's sister. I need to speak with him immediately about some medical billing issues. Mr. Adler is in meetings all afternoon, but I can have him call you back this evening. No, this can't wait until evening. This is urgent family business that needs his immediate attention. The assistant's tone shifted slightly, taking on the careful politeness reserved for difficult relatives who didn't understand business priorities. I'm sorry, but Mr. Adler specifically asked not to be interrupted today. The state audit team is conducting their review, and he needs to be available for questions. Grace felt pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock she was finally learning to open. State auditors, medical billing coordination for family members, facility records showing Mark as her emergency contact and financial guarantor for care she had never received. Tell him his sister called about Sunset Manor and Desert Springs rehabilitation. Tell him I have questions about records showing him as my guarantor for care I never received. The line went quiet for a moment. When Susan's voice returned, it carried a different quality, more cautious and less dismissive. I'll give him that message right away. Grace hung up and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the desert landscape she had chosen for its honesty and clarity. No hidden meanings in the saguaro cacti or mountain ranges. No bureaucratic complexity in the way sunlight moved across stone and sand. Just the straightforward reality of a place where survival depended on seeing clearly and responding appropriately to actual conditions, rather than official interpretations of those conditions. Behind her, the papers on her kitchen table represented a different kind of landscape. One where her identity could be borrowed without permission, her Medicare benefits could be harvested by people she trusted, and her autonomy could be systematically undermined while she went about her daily life, believing she was still in control of her own medical decisions. The anxiety that had started as confusion about a billing error was transforming into something sharper and more focused. Fear was being replaced by anger as she understood that this was not a mistake to be corrected, but a crime being committed against her by someone with intimate access to her personal information and legal authority to make decisions about her welfare. Grace returned to the table and opened a new manila folder. This one would hold evidence rather than questions, documentation rather than confusion. She was no longer trying to resolve a billing error. She was building a case against people who had decided her value as a family member was less important than her utility as a source of fraudulent Medicare revenue. Tomorrow, she would visit both facilities in person and demand to see the records that proved someone had been living portions of her life on paper, while she lived her actual life in ignorance of what was being done in her name. Tonight, she would organize what she had learned and prepare for a conversation with Mark that would either restore family trust or destroy what remained of it completely. The desert wind rattled her kitchen window with the persistent gentleness of weather that had been testing human structures longer than humans had been building them. Grace listened to the sound and felt oddly comforted by its honesty. Wind was exactly what it appeared to be. It didn't pretend to protect while it damaged, didn't claim love while it exploited, didn't offer help while it stole. Some things, at least, could still be trusted to show their true nature without apology or deception. The Scottsdale resort rose from the desert like a monument to wealth, its glass walls reflecting the setting sun in sheets of gold and copper. Grace parked her modest Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling the weight of her thrift store dress against her skin. The valet looked surprised when she handed him her keys, as if he had not expected someone like her to arrive in something so ordinary. Inside, the ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. The air smelled expensive flowers, cologne, and the subtle scent of money changing hands in quiet conversations. Grace stood near the back wall, clutching her small purse and watching tuxedos and sequined gowns swirl around her. Like she had stumbled into someone else's dream. Mark appeared at her elbow with a champagne flute and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made him look like a stranger pretending to be her brother. "You look presentable," he said, his gaze already drifting past her toward a cluster of board members near the stage. "Try to relax tonight, Grace. Dad wants this evening to be dignified, and that means no awkward questions about bills or Medicare confusion." She noticed how he positioned his body at an angle, creating just enough distance to signal to anyone watching that they were acquainted but not necessarily connected. To the important people in this room, she might have been a distant relative invited out of obligation rather than love. Someone who required management rather than inclusion. "Where should I sit?" she asked, hearing her own voice sound smaller than she intended in the vastness of orchestrated elegance. Mark gestured vaguely toward the back of the room with the casual dismissal of someone directing staff toward service areas. "Anywhere you're comfortable. The family seating is, well, it's reserved for board family. People with actual stakes in the company's future." Grace felt the words like small cuts, precise and designed to hurt without drawing visible blood. She found an empty chair at a table near the service entrance, between elderly couples who nodded with polite indifference before returning to their conversations about golf, tournaments and grandchildren whose trust funds would ensure their comfortable mediocrity. The lights dimmed with theatrical precision, and Leonard Adler appeared on stage like a king, addressing subjects who existed primarily to validate his magnificence. At 78, her father still commanded attention with his perfectly groomed white hair and voice that filled rooms without effort. The physical presence of someone who had never doubted his right to be heard and obeyed. He launched into stories Grace had been hearing her entire life. Familiar narratives about building Adler health systems from a single clinic into a nationwide empire of healing and profit. Each triumph was punctuated by calculated applause and camera flashes that would preserve this moment for corporate historians who wrote only victory stories. Grace had listened to these tales through countless family dinners where her mother's contributions vanished like morning mist. As if the company had been born fully formed from Leonard's will alone rather than built on the foundation of her mother's nursing expertise and financial sacrifices. The audience hung on his words with the devotion of people who understood that proximity to power was its own form of wealth. "Tonight," Leonard continued, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "I announce the future of our family legacy." Grace felt her stomach contract into a knot of anticipation and dread. Around her, guests leaned forward in their chairs like congregants awaiting revelation, their faces bright with the reflected glory of witnessing history being made in real time. Leonard first announced Mark's elevation to CEO, along with control of primary assets and a personal trust worth more than most small countries' annual budgets. The room erupted in approving murmurs and enthusiastic applause, the sound of people celebrating someone else's good fortune. As if it reflected well on their own judgment in attending the right parties. Mark stood at his reserved table near the stage, accepting congratulations with the gracious smile of someone who had been preparing for this moment since childhood, when success had been measured. Not by kindness or competence but by the ability to inherit wealth without embarrassing the family name. Next came Leonard's charitable donations, each announcement bringing fresh waves of admiration from guests who understood that institutional immortality was the highest form of earthly achievement. Medical schools that would train generations of doctors. Research foundations that would cure diseases not yet discovered. Buildings that would carry the Adler name long after his body had returned to desert dust. Then Leonard's gaze swept the ballroom like a searchlight and landed on Grace near the back. The microphone caught his slight smile as he located her among the crowd, the expression of a hunter who had spotted prey that could not escape. As for my daughter, Grace, he said, her name carrying a curl of something that might have been disappointment or contempt. The tone reserved for family members who had failed to live up to their potential. Scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd like the first drops of rain before a storm, as if they had been waiting for this part of the program. The moment when family drama would provide entertainment for people whose own families were too boring or functional to offer much gossip. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as every person in the room turned to stare at her. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to pity to the particular satisfaction that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation from a safe distance. She gripped the edge of her chair until her knuckles went white against the navy fabric of her dress. She chose to step away from the family business long ago, Leonard continued, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of final judgment, to dabble in charity work rather than pursue real medicine. The word, dabble, hit like a physical blow. Grace had spent 40 years saving lives in emergency rooms, holding families together during their worst moments. Making life and death decisions that kept communities functioning. But in her father's carefully crafted narrative, she became a well-meaning amateur playing at purpose while serious people did serious work. More laughter now, louder and more confident, the sound of people who appreciated wit even when it came at someone else's expense. Grace felt the room's energy shift, transforming her from family member to cautionary tale. From daughter to case study in the importance of knowing one's limitations. Leonard's voice grew more formal, taking on the cadence of legal documents being read at probate hearings. Where the dead spoke through lawyers to distribute earthly possessions among the living. Given recent concerns about her decision-making capabilities and memory issues, he announced with the gravity of a medical diagnosis. My legal team and I have determined it would be irresponsible to leave her assets she cannot properly manage. Gasps echoed through the ballroom like wind through expensive curtains. Followed by knowing nods from guests who appreciated prudent estate planning when they saw it. Grace felt the room's atmosphere change again, this time transforming her from cautionary tale into object of charity. Someone whose limitations required the wisdom and protection of people better equipped to make difficult decisions. To Grace, Leonard announced with the tone of someone bestowing mercy upon the undeserving, I leave a modest monthly stipend. Administered through a family-managed trust and contingent upon her cooperation with appropriate guardianship recommendations. He paused, letting the word, guardianship, settle into the collective consciousness like sediment in still water. For her own protection, of course. The phrase landed like a verdict pronounced by a judge who had already decided the case before hearing the evidence. Applause began slowly, tentatively, then built into genuine approval for Leonard's wisdom in protecting his troubled daughter from the dangers of her own poor judgment. Grace heard fragments of conversation from nearby tables floating above the applause like debris from a shipwreck. It's really for the best at their age. You can't trust elderly people with serious money. Better to be safe than sorry when someone starts losing their faculties. Her knees went weak, unreliable beneath the weight of public humiliation. She gripped the back of her chair harder, feeling the cool metal bite into her palms. As the room tilted slightly, faces blurring together into a sea of satisfied expressions that approved of her transformation from person to problem to responsibility properly managed by wiser heads. She had been declared incompetent before an audience of hundreds, her life reduced to a footnote in someone else's success story. Her 40 years of professional competence dismissed as evidence of confusion that required legal intervention. When the applause for her protection reached its crescendo, Grace found she could not breathe. The sound pressed against her chest like physical weight, each clap another nail in the coffin of her independence. She turned toward the side exit, her heels clicking against marble floors with the sharp precision of retreat. The sound echoing off walls that had witnessed her public erasure. Behind her, Leonard raised his glass in a toast to strong leadership and making difficult decisions about family members who lacked the judgment to make them for themselves. The laughter that followed her toward the door sounded like the approval of people who had never been forced to choose between dignity and survival. She pushed through the side door into a corridor where hotel efficiency replaced ballroom elegance. Where carpet cleaner and quiet desperation had honest sense compared to the expensive lies she had just escaped. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened to the life she had thought belonged to her. Grace. She turned to find Ruth Klein stepping out of shadows near the service elevator like a figure from a half-remembered dream. Ruth wore a simple dark suit and the tired eyes of someone who had spent decades watching powerful men destroy things they claimed to love, her gray hair pulled back in the no-nonsense style Grace remembered from family legal meetings when such gatherings had included her input. Ruth had been Leonard's in-house counsel before retiring with what gossips called a generous severance and what Grace now suspected might have been hush money. She was one of the few people who had ever looked at Grace like she was more than Leonard's disappointing daughter. Someone who deserved consideration rather than management. "I've been waiting for you," Ruth said quietly, her voice carrying urgency that cut through Grace's shock like smelling salts through unconsciousness. "Your mother asked me to give you something tonight." She knew this would happen. Ruth pressed a small unlabeled flash drive and a sealed envelope into Grace's hands, her fingers trembling slightly with what might have been fear or excitement. Or the weight of secrets finally being shared after too many years of silence. "She made me promise to wait until after Leonard's legacy announcement," Ruth whispered, glancing toward the ballroom doors as if expecting security to emerge and drag them both back to witness more family business being conducted in public. "She said you would need this most when he tried to erase you completely." Grace stared down at the items in her palm, feeling their weight like artifacts from an archaeological dig that might rewrite everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The flash drive felt warm from Ruth's hand. The envelope bore her mother's careful handwriting across the front in ink that had faded but not disappeared. "Don't open these here," Ruth said, her voice urgent. With the fear of people who had learned that walls had ears and loyalty was a luxury that could be revoked without notice. "And whatever you do, don't let Mark see them. Your mother spent 20 years preparing for this night." Grace slipped the items into her purse with hands that had stopped shaking, replaced by a steadiness that surprised her with its calm intensity. For the first time since walking into this glittering nightmare, she felt something besides humiliation rising in her chest. It was small and sharp and angry, and it felt very much like the beginning of a different kind of story than the one Leonard had just finished telling about her. "She knew," Grace whispered, the words carrying implications that would take time to fully understand. "She knew everything," Ruth replied, her eyes reflecting decades of watching truth being buried under legal language and family loyalty. "Now it's up to you to decide what to do with what she saved." Grace drove home through empty streets, the resort's glitter fading in her rearview mirror like fool's gold that lost its shine under honest moonlight. Desert streetlights cast orange circles on asphalt that still radiated the day's heat. Each mile between her and that ballroom measured the distance between the woman who had arrived with dignity intact and whatever remained after public dissection. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the cooling car for several minutes. The engine ticked with mechanical exhaustion that matched her own. Through her kitchen window, she could see the manila folder exactly where she had left it on the counter. The sight of her own life visible through glass felt like looking at a museum exhibit of someone she used to be. Inside her house, silence pressed against her like deep water. She dropped her heels by the front door. Each small thud echoed through rooms that suddenly felt too large for one person and too small for the weight of what she had just experienced. Her feet, swollen and angry from unaccustomed dress shoes, protested against the cool tile floor with honest pain. She emptied her purse onto the kitchen table with hands that moved automatically. Lipstick that had never been used because she had been too nervous to eat or drink. Car keys that had carried her away from her own public execution. The gala program with Leonard's smiling face on glossy paper. And finally, the sealed envelope and flash drive from Ruth. For a long moment, she simply stared at them. The envelope bore her mother's handwriting in ink that had faded from blue to something approaching gray. The flash drive was unmarked, anonymous, holding digital ghosts that might explain everything or nothing. The next morning arrived with mechanical punctuality that mocked her sleepless night. She had dozed fitfully in her chair rather than attempting the journey to her bedroom. Familiar surroundings might have made the previous evening feel like a nightmare from which she could wake refreshed and forgetful. The certified letter arrived with the postal worker's morning efficiency. It required her signature on a receipt that felt like signing her own death warrant. The young man waited with professional indifference while Grace signed with hands that had forgotten how to hold a pen steadily. His expression revealed nothing about whether he knew the envelope contained legal machinery necessary to transform someone from person to problem. Inside the thick envelope was legal paperwork that made the air in her kitchen feel thinner. A formal petition for conservatorship, typed with the clean precision of law offices where human lives were reduced to case numbers and billable hours. The petition listed Mark as the proposed conservator with casual authority. The attached documentation made her hands shake with recognition. Recent confusion regarding medical billing. Inability to understand financial matters. Concerning episodes of paranoid behavior regarding family members. Every question she had asked, every call she had made to the fraud hotline. Every attempt to understand what was happening had been transformed into evidence of her own incompetence. People with access to lawyers knew how to make protection look like persecution and concern look like confusion. Grace read the petition 3 times. Each reading made the words feel less like legal language and more like a foreign dialect designed to exclude her from conversations about her own future. Her coffee grew cold beside her untouched pill organizer. Outside her kitchen window, children rode bicycles past her house with careless joy. The phone rang at 10:30 with aggressive cheerfulness. Customer service representatives had been trained to sound helpful while delivering news that would destroy the recipient's peace of mind. Mrs. Adler? This is Jennifer from First National Bank. We're calling about a second mortgage application submitted in your name yesterday evening. Grace felt her mouth go dry with particular anxiety. She was hearing words that should make sense but felt completely foreign when applied to her own life. I never applied for a second mortgage. I understand your confusion, ma'am. The signatures don't quite match our records, which is why we're calling to verify your intent to borrow against your home equity. The application was submitted electronically with all proper documentation, but our fraud prevention software flagged it for manual review. The explanation felt like being told that someone had stolen her reflection while she was sleeping. Impossible to understand and terrifying in its implications for everything she had believed about the security of her own existence. I was at a family event last night. I never submitted any application for anything. I see. Well, we'll flag this as potentially fraudulent and begin our investigation. In the meantime, we're placing a security hold on all accounts associated with your social security number. Until we can verify that you are who you say you are. After the call ended, Grace sat staring at her landline phone as if it had betrayed her. Her name, her house, her carefully maintained financial independence felt negotiable, transferable, stealable by people who had access to electronic systems that reduced identity theft to routine paperwork. She pressed her forehead against the cool surface of her kitchen table. Tears slipped down her cheeks and pooled on wood that had once seemed like solid ground but now felt as unstable as everything else in her life. The taste of salt reminded her that her body still functioned according to honest principles even when everything else operated according to rules she had never learned. Maybe she really was just an old burden now. Too confused to understand modern systems and too stubborn to accept help from people who knew better than she did what was best for her future. The thought crept through her mind like infection through damaged tissue. It settled into spaces where confidence used to live and multiplied until self-doubt felt more real than any external evidence. Maybe Mark and Leonard were right to take control before she made mistakes that could not be undone. Before her confusion caused problems for people who had real responsibilities and important decisions to make. Maybe the kindest thing she could do for everyone, including herself, was to accept their protection and stop asking questions that only made everyone uncomfortable. That afternoon, she tried to water her small desert garden. This therapeutic ritual usually grounded her in the simple competence of nurturing life in hostile environments. But her hands shook too badly to hold the hose steady. Water splashed across gravel and pooled around her feet in dark patches that would evaporate within minutes under the desert sun. She gave up and sat on her back step. Heat waves shimmered off the ground like visual representation of her dissolving certainty about everything she had once taken for granted. The garden looked neglected despite her daily attention. Her own confusion seemed to communicate itself to the plants and make them doubt their ability to thrive. Everything felt like evidence against her. The spilled water, the shaking hands, the inability to understand documents that other people found perfectly clear. She was becoming the person they said she already was. Fragile, unreliable, in need of protection from her own poor judgment and declining faculties. That evening, her house felt like it belonged to someone else. Familiar objects made strange by the possibility that she might not have the legal right to own them much longer. Shadows gathered in corners that had never seemed threatening before. The ticking wall clock became unbearable, marking time that might no longer be hers to spend according to her own preferences. She wandered from room to room, touching objects that felt like artifacts from a life that was ending whether she was ready or not. Her mother's china in the dining room cabinet. Books she had collected over decades of reading. Photographs of a professional life that had apparently meant nothing to people who measured competence in dollars rather than lives saved. In her bedroom, she picked up the framed photograph of her parents from her nightstand. She studied her mother's face for clues about secrets that had apparently been hidden in plain sight for decades. Her mother looked young and hopeful, standing beside Leonard in what must have been the early days of his practice. Before hope had been replaced by whatever emotion people wore when they learned that the person they loved was not the person they had thought they were marrying. Grace tried to remember when that hope had died in her mother's eyes. When family dinners had become exercises in careful conversation that avoided topics that might provoke Leonard's anger or reveal information that was not meant to be shared with people who lacked the wisdom to understand its significance. She returned to the kitchen and picked up the conservatorship petition again. This time she studied the attached exhibit list with careful attention. Copies of her EOB. The SSA letter that had started everything. Documentation of her calls to the fraud hotline. A summary of concerning behaviors that included her questions about medical bills she had never seen before. Her own attempts to seek truth were being used as proof that she could no longer recognize it. Her efforts to understand what was happening to her life had been transformed into evidence that she lacked the capacity to participate in decisions about her own future. Grace held the pages over her kitchen trash can. Her hand trembled with exhaustion and the terrible temptation of surrender. It would be so easy to let them disappear. To accept the story being written about her and slide quietly into the role of the confused old woman who needed protection from her own poor judgment and paranoid suspicions. But as her hand hovered over the trash, she caught sight of her mother's envelope on the table beside the legal documents. The contrast was stark. One set of papers trying to erase her. Another promising to explain why erasure had been the plan all along. Instead of throwing anything away, she set the petition down and reached for her mother's envelope with hands that had stopped shaking. No more guessing what they planned to do with my life, she whispered to the empty kitchen. For once, I'm going to read what Mom left for me before I let them finish writing what they think my story should be. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, weighted with secrets that had been preserved for decades. Grace's fingers worked at the seal with careful precision. Like someone opening a time capsule that might contain either treasure or further evidence of her own foolishness. The despair that had pressed against her chest all day remained, but something else wound its way through it now. A thin, stubborn thread of anger that felt like metal wire in cracked stone. flexible but unbreakable. She had been a nurse long enough to know the difference between a patient who was giving up and one who was gathering strength to fight. Between someone who was dying and someone who was preparing to live differently than they had before. Tonight, for the first time since the SSA letter had arrived, she would stop being afraid of what she might discover. She would start being angry about what was being hidden from her. Whatever her mother had preserved in this envelope had been waiting 20 years for someone to need it badly. Enough to risk everything on the possibility that truth mattered more than family loyalty. Grace broke the wax seal with her thumbnail, the small snap echoing in her quiet kitchen. Inside the envelope, her mother's handwriting appeared on cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of lavender sachets. A second note, dated nearly 20 years ago, bore Ruth Klein's legal letterhead, to be delivered to Grace only after Leonard's formal legacy announcement. Grace's hands trembled as she unfolded her mother's letter and read the first line, "My dearest Grace, if you are reading this. Your father has just done what I begged him never to do, use his power to make you disappear." The words blurred as tears gathered in her eyes. She wiped them away and continued reading. Her mother's voice came through each carefully formed sentence like a whisper across decades of silence. The letter described how her mother had discovered Leonard using Adler clinics to bill phantom procedures under elderly patients' names. Some already dead, others too confused to question the charges. She had found altered billing codes, fabricated treatment records, and systematic theft from Medicare that funded Leonard's expansion. Grace's mind drifted to a memory she had buried for years. She was 25, fresh out of nursing school, visiting her parents' house on a rare weekend off. Late one night, she had found her mother at the kitchen table, surrounded by insurance forms and handwritten charts. Her mother muttered under her breath about numbers that did not add up. "What are you working on, Mom?" Grace had asked. Her mother looked up with startled eyes, quickly gathering papers into neat stacks. "Just bookkeeping. Your father thinks I don't understand the business side of things." Leonard had appeared in the doorway then. His presence filled the space like a storm front. "Evelyn, what are you doing with those files?" "I was just trying to help. You're not qualified to interpret medical billing." His voice carried cold authority that ended all discussion. He walked over and closed the folder with deliberate finality. "Grace, your mother gets confused by these forms. Maybe you should help her with something more suitable." Grace had felt the dismissal like a physical force. It pushed her away from questions she had not yet learned to ask. Her mother never spread those papers on the kitchen table again, at least not where Grace could see them. Now, reading her mother's letter, Grace understood those late-night sessions had been documentation, not confusion. Her mother had been building a case she never got to present. The letter continued, "I tried to confront him directly. But he offered me what he called a generous settlement, enough money to keep quiet and a promise that he would never target family. I thought I could protect you and Mark by accepting his terms. I was wrong." Grace's throat tightened as she read about the safety deposit box her mother had maintained in secret. Filled with copies of altered billing records, internal memos about aggressive reimbursement strategies, and recordings. Leonard did not know she had made of his meetings with a billing consultant. "I could not stop him then," her mother had written, "but I could document him. I knew that eventually, when you became too old to be useful to his image, he would turn the same system on you. The pattern never changes, Grace. Only the victims." Grace set the letter down and walked to her kitchen window. She looked out at the desert landscape her mother had loved. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels in the distance, their arms raised against the endless sky. Her mother used to say they were patient plants, capable of surviving anything if they had deep enough roots. Returning to the letter, Grace read the practical instructions her mother had left. Contact Ruth Klein, retrieve the safety deposit box contents, and trust your training as a nurse. You know how to read charts and spot patterns better than any lawyer Leonard could hire. Her mother had underlined one sentence in blue ink. Your worth was never his to measure in dollars or diagnoses. Grace folded the letter carefully and sat in the growing evening silence. The weight in her chest had shifted from despair to something sharper and more focused. Her father had not suddenly decided she was incompetent. He had been preparing for this moment for years, the same way he had prepared to silence her mother decades ago. She thought about small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. Mark quickly taking medical bills from her hands. Leonard's jokes about seniors who could not even read their own mail. Family gatherings where her nursing career was dismissed as playing with sick people while Mark's business degrees were celebrated as real accomplishments. The pattern had always been there. She had just been too close to see it clearly. Grace retrieved the flash drive from her purse and held it up to the kitchen light. Whatever recordings her mother had made were stored inside this small piece of plastic and metal, waiting to speak truths that had been buried for 20 years. Her mother had been patient, like the desert plants she loved. She had waited through years of silence, documenting and preparing, knowing that eventually Leonard would reveal himself completely. Tonight, in that glittering ballroom, he had done exactly that. Grace placed her mother's letter next to the conservatorship petition on her kitchen table. The contrast was stark. One document trying to erase her, the other proving she had never been alone in recognizing the danger. For the first time since the SSA letter had arrived, Grace felt connected to something larger than her own confusion. Her mother's voice reached across the years, reminding her that resistance was possible, even when it required waiting for the right moment to speak. The sadness remained, but underneath it, something harder was forming. The realization that what was happening to her now was just one more chapter in a story her mother had tried to end years ago. The ending would have to be different this time. It would have to be written by someone who understood both the pattern and how to break it. The next morning, Grace sat at her kitchen table with Ruth Klein's business card, running her thumb over the raised lettering. She had found it in her mother's letter, along with instructions to call Ruth when ready to see what had been saved for decades. The card felt substantial despite its small size, weighted with the authority of someone who had spent years learning when to speak. And when to preserve silence for strategic moments. Grace dialed the number with steady fingers. Ruth answered on the second ring, her voice hoarse but alert. "I wondered when you'd call," Ruth said. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 20 years. They arranged to meet at First National Bank downtown, where the safety deposit box had been quietly maintained under Ruth's name but designated for Grace's access. The precision of her mother's planning became apparent with each detail Ruth revealed. Evidence of someone who had understood that preparation was the only defense against people who controlled both rules and institutions. At the bank, the vault area smelled like metal and old paper. The security guard checked Grace's identification against cards that had been filed decades ago. Her signature was compared to examples her mother had provided when secrets still needed protection rather than revelation. When the steel box slid out with a metallic scrape, Grace felt like she was about to meet her mother again for the first time since childhood. Ruth had reserved a private viewing room where they could spread contents across a polished table without curious eyes documenting their discoveries. The box contained manila folders labeled with dates that corresponded to Grace's nursing career milestones and family events. The first folder held photocopies of insurance claims with medical codes changed in different colored ink. Grace recognized her father's handwriting immediately. The sharp, impatient scrawl that had signed permission slips throughout her childhood, now revealed as authorizing theft on an industrial scale. "Your mother was meticulous," Ruth said, opening another folder. She documented everything she could access without triggering suspicion. Internal memos about what Leonard called revenue optimization through creative billing interpretations. Grace studied printouts where her mother had circled phrases that now carried sinister implications. Maximize reimbursement potential. Elderly patients rarely question detailed statements. Nursing home residents lack family oversight for billing verification. The language was clinical, professional, designed to make systematic fraud sound like innovative business strategy. Several documents bore Mark's initials as the approving financial officer. His neat signature authorized payments for services never performed to patients never admitted. Grace felt particular sting seeing evidence that her brother had not simply inherited this system but had actively participated in its operation. Ruth plugged a USB drive into her laptop with careful efficiency. Leonard's recorded voice crackled through small speakers, discussing market opportunities in the Medicare demographic with enthusiasm for an underexploited resource. "We've got a sweet spot here," Leonard's voice explained to someone whose identity was not revealed. Elderly patients don't read their mail carefully. Half are too confused to question charges, the other half too proud to admit they don't understand what they're being billed for. Grace felt heat rise in her chest as she listened to her father treating Medicare fraud like business opportunity. He discussed elderly patients like inventory to be processed for maximum profit rather than human beings deserving honest care and transparent billing. In another recording, Leonard instructed a clinic manager to push through long-term care claims for patients already discharged. He explained that the paperwork trail was too complex for most people to follow. By the time anyone figured out discrepancies, payments would already be processed and distributed. How could my mother record these without him knowing? Grace asked. She had legitimate access to his office for bookkeeping responsibilities, Ruth explained. This was before everything went digital, when people still conducted sensitive business face-to-face. She used a small recorder hidden in her purse during financial review meetings. Ruth's expression grew darker. Leonard never suspected the woman he dismissed as just handling paperwork was building a federal case against him. He made the classic mistake of underestimating someone he had already decided was beneath his notice. Grace felt complex emotions as she realized her mother's apparent acceptance of dismissal had actually been strategic positioning. It allowed her access to information that a more obviously threatening person would never have been permitted to see. Why didn't my mother use this evidence to stop him? She tried. Ruth's voice carried 20 years of frustration at justice delayed. I helped her contact a federal healthcare fraud investigator back then, Agent Sarah Morales, but without a current victim willing to testify, and without Leonard making recent mistakes that could be connected to historical patterns, the statute of limitations protected him from prosecution for older charges. Ruth leaned forward with intensity of someone who had been waiting decades to have this conversation. But now he's made the mistake of targeting his own daughter. The fraudulent charges in your name, combined with the conservatorship petition that uses your questions as evidence of incompetence, creates a clear pattern of elder financial abuse. This gives federal investigators jurisdiction they didn't have 20 years ago. Grace felt something shift in her understanding of her situation. A transformation from victim to potential weapon in a case that had been building momentum longer than she had been aware of its existence. Her questions about fraudulent charges were not evidence of confusion but proof of ongoing crime that could finally be prosecuted. Ruth had already reached out to Agent Morales, now a senior investigator with the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Unit. She had been waiting 2 decades for someone with standing to file complaints that could reopen a case she had never forgotten. That afternoon, they met in a windowless federal office that smelled like determination and old coffee. Crimes against vulnerable populations were investigated here by people who understood that fraud was violence committed with paperwork instead of weapons. Agent Morales looked exactly like someone who spent days hunting white-collar criminals, who believed their education and social status provided immunity from consequences. Sharp eyes that missed nothing, practical clothes that announced competence, rather than fashion, and patient demeanor of someone who knew the best cases built themselves slowly through careful evidence accumulation. She reviewed Grace's documents with focused attention, asking precise questions about dates, amounts, procedures, and people. This revealed familiarity with healthcare fraud patterns that transcended individual cases. This isn't just fraud, Morales said after listening to portions of audio recordings. This is a machine that's been running for decades. Your father just handed us proof that he's willing to turn it on his own family when it serves his purposes. Grace described the fake cardiac catheterization that never happened, phantom long-term care charges for services never received, the conservatorship petition that cited her questions as evidence of mental deterioration, and Leonard's public humiliation at a gala designed to celebrate his wisdom in protecting vulnerable family members. Morales took notes in a small notebook with precise handwriting. Someone who understood that details mattered when cases went to trial. Her pen moved quickly across pages that would become part of an official record that could not be dismissed as family drama or private disputes. We can build a comprehensive case around this, Morales explained. The historical pattern your mother documented, combined with current charges against you, gives us both conspiracy and elder abuse angles that create federal jurisdiction. But if we move forward, we move publicly. No quiet settlements, no family conferences, no private agreements that allow criminal activity to continue under different management. Grace thought about Mark's threat to show the court her episodes of confusion. She thought about Leonard's speech describing her as a burden requiring protection from her own poor judgment. She thought about all the other elderly patients whose names had been used to fund the Adler empire, while they struggled to understand bills for care they had never received. There's an Adler Health shareholder meeting scheduled for next month, Morales said, consulting a calendar that tracked movements of people whose crimes required careful timing to prosecute effectively. If we coordinate properly, we could make arrests there. Public accountability for public crimes, with media coverage that sends messages to other healthcare providers who might be tempted to follow similar patterns. Grace felt a moment of vertigo imagining Leonard and Mark being led away in handcuffs in front of cameras and investors. Complete destruction of whatever remained of her family's reputation and her own connection to people who had shaped her identity for 65 years. Whatever remained of her family would be destroyed completely. But as she looked at evidence spread across Agent Morales's desk, she realized her family had been destroyed years ago when people who claimed to love her had decided her value as a person was less important than her utility as a victim. He ended us a long time ago, she said aloud. I'm just making sure everyone can see clearly what he's been doing while pretending to protect people like me. Agent Morales nodded with satisfaction of someone who had learned to recognize the moment when a victim became a witness. When someone decided that truth mattered more than maintaining comfortable lies that protected people who had never deserved protection. Then let's make sure everyone gets a very clear view of what Leonard Adler's legacy actually looks like when you remove the public relations and examine the underlying criminal enterprise. Walking out of the federal building, Grace felt desert sun on her face with intensity that seemed different from any warmth she had experienced before. For weeks, she had been carrying evidence that she was being systematically erased by people who claimed authority to make decisions about her competence and future. Now she held evidence that she could write the next chapter herself. Using her mother's patient documentation and her own stubborn refusal to disappear quietly into legal machinery, designed to transform inconvenient elderly people into manageable wards of family members who prioritized convenience over relatives' autonomy. The case would take time to build properly, but the foundation was already solid. 20 years of hidden recordings, altered documents, and one elderly woman's determination to protect a daughter she would never live to see fight back against a system designed to make fighting back look like evidence of the very incompetence it claimed to be treating. The Adler Health shareholder meeting took place in a gleaming Phoenix convention center, its glass walls reflecting morning sun like mirrors designed to blind anyone who looked too directly at the wealth they contained. Inside, banners reading, "Adler Legacy: The Next Chapter," hung from ceilings above investors in expensive suits, who had gathered to celebrate another year of profitable healthcare. Grace walked through the main entrance with Ruth Klein on one side and Agent Morales on the other. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps remained steady. In her purse were copies of every document they had collected over weeks of preparation. The EOB that had started everything. The SSA letter that had revealed the pattern. Her mother's recordings that proved the pattern was deliberate. Around them, plainclothes federal agents moved with casual efficiency into position near exits and camera angles. These were professionals who had done this many times before, positioning themselves with precision that understood arrests were theatrical performances. They sent messages to communities of potential criminals who needed to understand that law enforcement was watching and keeping score. Leonard commanded the stage like a conductor before his orchestra. He wore his signature navy suit and spoke with authority of someone who had never doubted his right to be heard, and obeyed by audiences that existed primarily to validate his vision. His voice carried easily through the sound system as he discussed ethical care delivery and trust as the cornerstone of the Adler name. Each phrase was crafted to reassure investors that their money supported an enterprise dedicated to healing, rather than one that had systematically defrauded the federal healthcare system for decades while presenting itself as a model of responsible medical practice. Mark sat in the front row with confident posture of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He occasionally checked his phone with casual arrogance of someone who believed his biggest challenge would be managing administrative details of inheriting an empire, rather than explaining how he had helped operate a criminal conspiracy. Today, Leonard announced with gravity appropriate to historical moments, "I am proud to officially transfer controlling shares of Adler Health Systems to my son Mark. This ensures our commitment to excellence continues into the next generation of American healthcare leadership." The audience erupted in appreciative applause that echoed off polished surfaces like validation seeking more validation. Cameras flashed from the media section where reporters documented what they expected would be routine transfer of corporate power from one generation of healthcare administrators to the next. Grace watched her brother stand and wave to the crowd with gracious humility of someone accepting a crown that had always rightfully belonged to him. His smile carried no trace of concern that federal agents were already moving toward the stage, with handcuffs and warrants that would transform this celebration into something considerably less festive. Agent Morales stepped forward with her badge visible, cutting through applause like a scalpel through infected tissue. "Leonard Adler, Mark Adler, we need you to step down from the stage immediately." The room fell into silence that follows explosions, when ears expect sound but receive only absence of everything that had seemed normal moments before. Leonard's face shifted from confusion to recognition to rage as he saw Grace standing near the back of the auditorium, with federal agents flanking her position like bodyguards protecting someone whose safety had suddenly become a matter of official concern. Mark's confident expression cracked like poorly maintained pavement under pressure. His phone clattered to the floor as he realized the inheritance ceremony he had been anticipating was about to become an arrest proceeding documented by every camera in the room. Grace approached the technology table with hands that had stopped shaking. She connected her tablet to the projection system, with calm efficiency of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment and knew exactly what needed to happen next. Suddenly Leonard's recorded voice filled the auditorium, discussing Medicare patients who don't read their mail carefully anyway, and instructing clinic staff to maximize billing opportunities with the elderly demographic, because they're too confused or proud to question charges for services they can't remember receiving. Gasps echoed through the audience like wind through expensive curtains, followed by angry murmur of investors, realizing their money had been supporting an enterprise that bore no resemblance to the ethical healthcare provider described in marketing materials and annual reports. Phones appeared throughout the audience as shareholders began recording the unfolding crisis. Some captured footage with intention of preserving evidence. Others hoped to sell footage to news organizations hungry for stories about corporate crime that affected real people in measurable ways. Grace stepped up to the microphone Leonard had abandoned. Her knees trembled but her spine remained straight with posture of someone who had spent 40 years standing beside hospital beds, where truth mattered more than comfort and accuracy mattered more than politeness. "My name is Grace Adler," she said, words amplified throughout the convention center with clarity of someone who had finally found her voice. After months of being told her questions were evidence of confusion rather than evidence of crimes. "I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am a retired emergency room nurse who discovered that my father has been using my Medicare number, and the Medicare numbers of people like me, to steal from the healthcare system he claims to protect." She held up the EOB that had transformed her from trusting daughter into federal witness, in a case that would redefine how healthcare fraud was prosecuted when family members were both perpetrators and victims. "This shows cardiac procedures I never received, performed on days when I was volunteering at a free clinic, helping people who couldn't afford the kind of medical care that my father was billing Medicare for without actually providing." The audience listened in absolute silence as Grace described the conservatorship petition that had used her questions about fraudulent charges as evidence that she needed a guardian to protect her from her own confusion. The public humiliation at Leonard's gala, where her concerns had been dismissed as symptoms of mental decline rather than rational responses to criminal activity. With each word, she watched faces in the crowd shift from shock to understanding to anger, as they realized their investments had been subsidizing systematic fraud that targeted the most vulnerable members of society while presenting itself as a model of ethical healthcare administration. Agent Morales stepped forward with handcuffs as other agents moved toward the stage with coordinated precision. Leonard Adler, Mark Adler, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and elder financial abuse. As agents read them their rights with voices that carried across the convention center like announcements at sporting events. Leonard's eyes found Grace in the crowd. His face twisted with something that looked like betrayal. As if she had broken some fundamental rule by refusing to disappear quietly when his plans required her silence. You destroyed everything we built, he hissed as they pulled his hands behind his back. The microphone still caught his words and broadcast them to an audience that had gathered to celebrate his legacy. And was now witnessing its complete destruction. No, Grace replied, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. With authority of someone who had finally learned the difference between destruction and accountability. I stopped you from destroying anyone else. The audience erupted in chaos that felt more honest than the orchestrated applause that had greeted Leonard's speech. Some shareholders shouted questions about their investments. Others demanded to know how long fraud had been occurring and whether they could be held liable for profiting from criminal activity they claimed not to have known about. One elderly woman in the front row stood and called out with voice of someone who had been waiting decades for this moment. My husband got bills like that before he died. We thought it was just a mistake, but we paid them because we trusted the Adler name. Another voice added from the middle of the auditorium. How many families did you steal from? How many elderly people died thinking they owed money for care they never received? Agent Morales addressed the crowd with professional calm of someone who had delivered similar explanations many times before. She explained that investigation was ongoing and that anyone with concerns about billing irregularities should contact the healthcare fraud hotline, where their complaints would be investigated with seriousness that crimes against vulnerable populations deserved. Media crews pushed forward with aggressive enthusiasm of reporters who understood they were documenting a story that would resonate far beyond the Phoenix business community. They captured footage of corporate crime being exposed and prosecuted in real time, rather than hidden behind legal settlements that protected criminals while abandoning their victims. As Leonard and Mark were led away in handcuffs, Grace remained at the microphone. She watched 20 years of hidden crimes finally exposed to harsh light of public accountability. She thought about her mother, who had spent so many nights documenting evidence and waiting for justice that never came in her lifetime. Who had trusted that someday someone would find her recordings and use them to stop a criminal enterprise that had been protected by family loyalty and institutional respect for too many years. Walking out of the convention center, Grace felt desert air with clarity that seemed to penetrate deeper than her lungs. Breathing itself had become easier when the weight of secrets was finally lifted from her chest. Behind her, investors and media crews continued heated discussions about accountability and restitution. About how systematic fraud had been allowed to continue for decades, under protection of a family name that commanded respect in communities that trusted healthcare providers to serve patients rather than exploit them. Ahead of her lay complicated work of rebuilding a life that had been nearly stolen from her. But for the first time since the SSA letter had arrived, Grace felt like the author of her own story, rather than a character in someone else's narrative about proper management of inconvenient elderly relatives who asked too many questions. The handcuffs clicking around her father's wrists had sounded exactly like the safety deposit box opening. Metal on metal, containing secrets that could no longer stay hidden once someone finally had courage to insist that truth mattered more than family loyalty. And that justice delayed was still justice when it finally arrived with badges and warrants and authority to transform victims into witnesses. 6 months after the arrests, Grace stood before a bright glass storefront in a Mesa Strip mall, watching workmen hang the final sign above the entrance. The letters were simple but clear: Evelyn Adler Senior Care Advocacy Center. Her mother's name, the woman who had seen the danger first and prepared tools to fight. It now marked a place where other elderly people could find protection she had never received. Inside, fluorescent lights that reminded everyone of government offices had been replaced with warm lamps that cast gentle circles on comfortable furniture. Seniors sat at round tables with volunteers. spreading Medicare statements and medical bills across surfaces designed for understanding rather than intimidation. The air smelled like fresh coffee and the particular kind of relief that comes from finally having someone listen. Grace settled at a table with Harold Martinez, a widower whose hands shook as he showed her a hospital bill for procedures his late wife had supposedly received after her death. His confusion was familiar. The same bewildered hurt Grace had felt when first reading her own fraudulent charges. "This says Maria had heart surgery 3 weeks after her funeral," Harold said, voice barely above a whisper. "How is that possible?" Grace spread the papers out carefully, the way she had learned to organize patient charts during her nursing years. She pointed to a line item that stood out like a red flag to her trained eye. "This charge shouldn't be here," she said gently. "Let's call the billing department together and get this corrected." Her hands remained steady as she dialed the number, voice carrying authority of someone who had learned to ask the right questions and demand real answers. Harold watched her with gratitude of a drowning man who had finally found solid ground. The restitution funds from the Adler case, combined with seized assets from the healthcare fraud investigation, had funded this center and 3 others across Arizona. The money Leonard had stolen from Medicare patients was now paying for advocates who could help victims understand their rights and challenge fraudulent claims. Mark worked at the center twice a week, part of his plea agreement and community service requirements. He sat at a back table taking phone calls and filing forms, his designer suits replaced by casual clothes that made him look like someone learning to be useful without a title. Sometimes their eyes met across the room, and Grace saw her brother as he might have been if Leonard had taught him to build things rather than take them. She did not forgive easily, and trust was something that would have to be earned one honest conversation at a time. But she allowed him to witness what their father's crimes had cost other families, hoping that proximity to real harm might teach him something about real responsibility. In the evenings, when the center closed and Grace locked the doors, she stood in the quiet lobby reading her mother's name on the wall. Evelyn Adler, the woman who had documented crimes in secret, waited through decades of silence, and trusted that someday the right person would find her evidence and use it wisely. Grace still received mail daily. Tax notices, legal updates, routine correspondence from Social Security and Medicare. Now she opened every envelope immediately, spreading the contents on her kitchen table where she could read them completely. She picked up each document, examined it with careful attention she had once given to patient charts, and filed everything in labeled folders. No one took papers from her hands anymore. No one dismissed her questions as confusion or suggested that complex financial matters were beyond her understanding. The conservatorship petition had been dismissed after Leonard's arrest, and the modest trust he had planned for her protection had been dissolved in favor of direct control over her inheritance. She visited Leonard's federal prison only in her imagination, wondering if he understood that the empire he had built on stolen Medicare dollars now funded services for the very people he had targeted. She doubted he had learned anything from his conviction except that getting caught was a failure of strategy rather than morality. One afternoon, after helping an elderly woman dispute a fraudulent home health charge, Grace signed a form authorizing the center to act as the woman's advocate with insurance companies. As her pen touched the paper, she paused to feel the weight of the moment. Her signature now carried authority to protect rather than just protest. The signature looked exactly like the one she had practiced in nursing school. Clear and confident, belonging unmistakably to someone who knew her own name and what it was worth. Outside the center's windows, desert afternoon light turned the mountains purple and gold. Grace gathered her paperwork and checked that the coffee pot was turned off, the same closing routine she had performed in hospital break rooms for 40 years. But this was different. Here, she was not just following protocols established by others. She was creating a place where elderly voices could be heard above the machinery of bureaucracy and fraud. She thought about all the people who would sit at these tables tomorrow, bringing bills they could not understand and fears they could not name. They would leave with phone numbers to call, advocates to help them. And the knowledge that their confusion was not a symptom of aging but a rational response to deliberate deception. On the drive home, Grace passed the Phoenix office building where Adler Health Systems had once operated from the top 3 floors. The Adler signs were gone now, replaced by a community health organization that provided free legal aid to Medicare fraud victims. Leonard's legacy had been transformed into something that would have horrified him. A place where elderly people learned to fight back instead of disappearing quietly. Grace parked in her driveway and sat for a moment, watching heat waves shimmer off the asphalt. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families dealing with the aftermath of healthcare fraud. New opportunities to use her mother's documentation and her own hard-won expertise to protect people who deserved better than what they had received. For the first time in months, when she signed her name on the day's final paperwork, it felt like it truly belonged to her. She walked to her front door with keys that unlocked a house that finally felt like it belonged to someone who had the legal right to live in it according to her own preferences. Inside, her kitchen table was clear except for the evening mail, which she would read carefully and file appropriately because understanding what was written about her life had become both a skill and a responsibility. The desert wind moved through her neighborhood with patient persistence of weather that had been shaping this landscape. Long before humans arrived with their institutions and elaborate systems for making victims feel grateful for the privilege of being exploited by people who claimed to care about their welfare. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending this